G'day, I'm Owen, and you've joined this week's episode of The Pub Test. And yes, we are continuing our expose into the suspects of Jack the Ripper. And this week's one is quite high on the list. In fact, I think you'll stay in the top 5 suspects for quite some time. That is the man by the name of James Kelly. So to understand why he is such a high-profile suspect, we need to look at his history. So let's get straight into that right now. Now, James Kelly was born in 1860 in Lancashire, and his mum, Sarah, was only 15 years old at the time. Now, she hands the child, James, over to her mother, Teresa. And James never gets to meet his mother ever. Now, in saying that, it's not that Sarah had no affection at all for her son. Obviously, her situation in life would have been extremely difficult. But 10 years later, she does marry someone. He's quite well off, doing well in business. But tragically for him, in 1874, in May, he passes away, but he leaves behind a share in the shipping business and a house in Peru. Sarah doesn't cope very well with this change in her circumstance, and her health deteriorates to the point where in July of 1874, she too passes away. But in her will, she left £25,000 in trust to James for when he reaches the age of 25. That's the first time in James's life he found out that Teresa, who he thought was his mother, was actually his grandmother. Now, it's safe to say that he doesn't take this news well. James is only 14 at this time. He's already left school and doing an apprenticeship as an upholsterer. Finding out all this news about his mother, he withdraws from his apprenticeship and then goes off to school somewhere else to learn clerical work. And in probably tragic circumstances as well, Teresa, his grandmother, passes away only a year after all of this, or about 18 months after all of this, in 1876, leaving this 16-year-old boy all alone in the world. He was able to complete his studies though. So this massive upheaval in his life in these last few years, and the formative years of your life as well, he completed his studies and picked up a job doing some clerical work. At this stage of James's life, he is a devout Catholic living on the straight and narrow. He decides to quit his clerical job and move back to London and retake up the upholstery trade. So he applies to the Trade Society, the Upholstery Trade Society, and they say, well, we'll find you a position, but take up a bit of casual work first. It's at this point he moves in with 2 older individuals, one in his mid-30s and another bloke who was in the upholstery trade. This is where his life was open to a few new opportunities, namely heavy drinking and paying women for company. It seems though that he doesn't stay in this area. He goes away. Not much is known, but it would seem logical that he was very much involved in a fairly fast way of living during his years of 18, 19, and 20. But then he moves back, reconnects with these 2 individuals, and spends a lot of his nights drinking and no doubt other activities down around Whitechapel. Yes, where the Whitechapel murders happened, where Jack the Ripper killed his victims. So James Kelly would have known the area quite well. But the story's got a few more twists before we even get to that. James, though, comes across this young girl, she's 18 years old, Sarah Brider. And he thinks, well, she's not too bad. I might get to know her. And they hit it off. She takes him home to meet the parents. And the parents think, well, here's a very well-to-do person. He's very religious. He's got good prospects. He's doing his trade. So they were quite happy that their daughter had found this upstanding individual. So things seemed to be going very well. But then the relationship turned intimate, and it went downhill from there. I won't go into the details, you can look them up, but things didn't go the way James thought, and he blamed her. Not his lack of understanding of a proper relationship rather than paying people for that type of company. But because of this, his mood swings returned. But because of these mood swings, it starts to put a distance between them. Sarah starts to get a bit cool. He panics and proposes marriage, because that's going to fix it, isn't it? Well, it took a bit of time, but she did accept that proposal. But a complication came up. He now finds out that he's got a communicable disease that he picked up from these other women previously. Though he says he must have got it from Sarah. Doesn't point the finger at himself. No. It had to be her, even though he was the only person she'd ever been with. But he doesn't want this to get known, so he goes to the doctor, but then decides he's going to treat himself. Now his parents are saying, hey, look, you proposed, she's accepted. When's the wedding? Let's get this moving. And he's putting it off because he's now worried about this disease that he's got. The sad part is he had secured a good job. But all this stress that he was now facing seems to have sent him back down the wrong paths again. He was getting massive headaches and other issues. He got fired from his job. The reason, because he didn't quite seem right in the head. And what is important to establish here, that it was the 4th of June, 1883, when these two were married. June 1883. Had to state that because things get crazy from here. They were fighting a lot. And when I say they, it was James always accusing Sarah of something, giving him a disease, that she was a prostitute, that he was tricked into marriage because the family wanted his inheritance. And then all the time apologizing, saying he didn't mean these things. So he'd blow up in a rage and then apologize not long after. Very controlling behavior. It all started coming to a head around June 18th. I think it was around Sarah's birthday, and James again is feeling remorse for the way he's been carrying on. He says, well, I'll take my wife out when she gets home from work. But she arrives late, an hour late. He flies into a rage, accusing her again of being a prostitute and whatever else under the sun. But again, instantly, he just was full of remorse and collapses into a chair crying. So what happens next is very, very tragic. We have to remember they were married June 4th. We're now only talking June 22nd. This whole 2 weeks of married life have been a misery. But Sarah comes home from work and tells her mother, I'm going out to see James. An hour later, James turns up to the bride's household and Sarah's not with him. They say, where's Sarah? He flies off into a rage, goes out, comes home with her about an hour later, but obviously things aren't good. Now, again, won't go into the gory detail of this, but he has a penknife and he starts attacking Sarah. Mrs. Brider, she's screaming, she's hysterical, understandably, tries to break it up. James, being the loving son-in-law he is, picks her up and throws her across the room. Now, following that, he runs to his bedroom and locks the door. He didn't flee the house, but he went to the bedroom. The police were obviously called. Paramedics of what they were at the time are called. James is arrested for attempted murder. And surprise, surprise, he feels remorse for what he did. Whilst he's in the lockup, he says, I need a pen and paper. I need to write Sarah a letter of apology. Which he does so, begging for one last chance. And remember, this is after he's taken a penknife to the throat of his newly married bride. Well, tragically for Sarah, she succumbed of those injuries. She never got to read that letter, though no doubt over the last 2 weeks it would have sounded exactly the same as everything else he's been saying. But now these attempted murder charges are upgraded to murder. Now, justice didn't mess around back in those days, so this event happened on June 21st. He's been charged. The trial is August the 1st. Yep, 2 weeks after it's all happened. James Kelly pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. And if only it were that simple that you could do whatever you like and say, I was just out of my mind in that moment. Someone has examined him, obviously from the prosecution side, and said, well, you're not actually insane. You knew what you were doing. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to hang on August the 20th. Yep, 20 days after the trial. There was no long term on death row with endless appeals. He was facing the death sentence in only a matter of a couple of weeks. So things had to move pretty quickly here for him. And his lawyer does try and get clemency so that he wouldn't be hung. They even have a petition. And what I find very surprising here, which may explain some things, I don't know for sure, but his in-laws, yes, Sarah's parents, signed the petition for clemency. Now, without knowing any other detail, I could only think of a couple of reasons as to why a parent would do this. Firstly, you really have forgiveness in your heart. I don't know how I would act in that situation. You'd like to think you could do that, but maybe they were such upstanding people. The other thing is they might just had something against the death penalty. Wanted him locked up, but didn't necessarily want that eye for an eye. Or maybe they did have some access to that inheritance by means of that marriage. Perhaps they could get some cash out of it, but if he was put to death, that would then be gone. Well, we don't know. The only thing we know for sure is they did sign that petition. Another doctor comes in and basically says this guy is a total nut job. He is insane. He didn't know what he was doing. And so clemency was actually given. He was then sentenced to life at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital in England. So that's it. He's now locked up. No longer a threat to the community. If we could say that this story could get any more strange, it would be understating it. Apparently within prison, him and another inmate observed the keys hanging off the warden's belts and thought, we could make one of those. And they set about doing that. And so then, in 1888, James Kelly is able to unlock the door, jump the 6-foot fence, and disappear. Well, that's his version of how he escaped from Broadmoor, which he did. There is another explanation which is possibly more reasonable. That one of his former associates, one of his former drinking buddies, was seen in the area on the day he escaped. And he may have had a bit of money to hand to somebody to look the other way while old Bud did a runner. That is possible, considering that if there was any way he still had access to that inheritance, well, he would have had the money to be able to do that. But who knows? Maybe he was that ingenious that he was able to make a key and escape. But I more think a bit of money changed hands. But now he's loose on the streets around Whitechapel in 1888. Now, his actual whereabouts after escaping in January of 1888 are difficult to prove because we're relying on his word of what he was doing. He says basically he stayed with some relatives for a while after moving down to Liverpool. But in previous times, there was no mention of relatives at all. In fact, he had a very, very small family. So we can't really trust what he says about his own movements, except for a couple of instances. But what is of note when it comes to the Jack the Ripper cases, he was on the radar. The police were considering him as a potential suspect. In fact, after Mary Kelly was murdered, as one of the Jack the Ripper victims, the police went to his in-laws' place, the Striders' house, to find out if they knew his whereabouts. And in his police file, there is a note around that time saying, we really need to find this person and recapture him. So he was on the radar. But before we go into the probability of James Kelly being Jack the Ripper, his story after these events also becomes a little bit strange. And we're only going to go through 3 certified events that we can prove, because these words don't come from him. Now, this we know for a fact is that he did travel to the United States. So he had gone to Europe and then across to the United States as well. And then in 1896, so this is 8 years after escaping Broadmoor, he walks into the consulate in New Orleans and says, I'm James Kelly. I've escaped from Broadmoor. I'm giving myself up. Well, they say, well, that's great, mate. Awesome work. Well, you get on a boat and we'll let the people on the other end know that you're coming and they'll pick you up and take you back. He's got, sweet, let's do that. Yeah, obviously things were way different. Like today, if you did that, you'd be locked up, you'd be on a plane. There's none of this, get yourself back there and we'll look after this. But he goes through with it. He gets on that boat. But the boat arrived a day early. So here's James Kelly hanging around. No one's here to meet him. The authorities, the other side, didn't check to see exactly when the boat was arriving. So he gives up on it. He says, well, off I go. And he disappears again. But then in 1901, he's in Vancouver and he goes to the British consul and says, I want to give myself up. Nobody in London is remotely interested in this at all. They don't care. So he hangs around, decides to head back and just hand himself in. But on the way over, he changes his mind and again, he disappears. In 1907, Broadmoor themselves discharge him from being an inmate. They basically say, we no longer want anything to do with this bloke. He's not our concern anymore. He's off our books. So it's surprising then in 1927 when this sickly, aged person turns up to the gates and says, "Let me in." Which they do. James Kelly walks back through those gates of Broadmoor, and in 1929, he passes away. Now, in his last years, he does do some writings, and some people say that he sort of admits to being Jack the Ripper, but he does not make that claim at all. He did say he was over in the United States and other areas fighting evil. With his mental health, maybe he was fighting his own battles, but some people say that because he had this hatred for prostitutes, which apparently he wrote about very strongly in his writings, that makes him a prime suspect of being Jack the Ripper. They even say there's some crimes that happened where he says he was, that would prove that he continued this crime spree everywhere he went. Yet I question that just to start with, because we don't know for sure his movements. If you're relying on him to state where he was, well, then that's an issue. And just the other thing that just raises a doubt in my mind for definitely saying this person did it is that the initial crime didn't quite match the bill. There was no surgical precision in what he did. It was just rage. And the attack was done in that manner. And Sarah lived for about a day after that attack. Now, did he learn more skills when he was in Broadmoor? Don't know. But you would think, with the remorse he often showed, whether it was genuine or not, right at the end there, you might just throw yourself out and say, yep, I was Jack the Ripper, knowing all of the interest in this case. That's not to say that he's not Jack the Ripper. I'd be very interested in your comments on this. I think he's definitely in the top 5, solidly in the top 5. And as we go through these, he'll probably stay up there for a bit. And I'm open-minded. If there's some more evidence people want to point to and say, well, what about this? Well, we can discuss that in the comments section. But just for me, I feel at the moment there is a better solution. It will take us a while to get to there, and there's no doubt a lot more evidence we will uncover. But just wait around for that one when we do get to the reveal of what I think is the actual true story of Jack the Ripper. So that brings us an end to this week's episode of The Pub Test. We are going to be putting up some different videos, as we said, here and there. So if you are subscribing, make sure you do subscribe. But if you see something that is not quite in this genre, don't worry too much about it. Just bypass that one. If you see the Jack the Ripper, the Pub Test, all that appear on the screen, then you know this is the content for you. Make sure you check out the books. Thank you very much for watching. It is greatly appreciated, and we will see you all again on the next episode of The Pub Test.